True greatness is not measured by the power we wield over others, but by the capacity to serve with love in the small, everyday tasks. In a world that often values status, wealth, and visibility, the story of a humble Italian peasant woman invites us to a profound reflection on the true meaning of holiness. She did not found religious orders, nor did she write theological treatises, nor suffer martyrdom by blood. Her entire life was spent among pots, brooms, dust, and the demands of a noble household. Yet through this seemingly invisible and monotonous routine, she reached the highest realms of heaven. This is the story of Saint Zita of Lucca, the patroness of domestic workers, homemakers, and bakers, a woman who transformed manual labor into a continuous and fragrant prayer to God. Zita was born in the year 1218 in the small village of Montegrati, nestled in the hills of Tuscany, not far from the city of Lucca, Italy. Her parents, Giovanni and Bonissima Lombardo, were extremely poor peasants, but rich in great faith. Her mother's very name, Bonissima, meaning very good, reflected the environment of piety and virtue in which the girl was raised. The family lived by hard work on the land, relying on the harvests and divine providence for their daily sustenance. From her earliest years, Zita absorbed the deep religiosity of her parents. She learned that God was present in all things, and that prayer was not just a moment of the day, but a constant attitude of the heart. Her maternal uncle, Graziano, was a hermit who lived on a nearby mountain, where he had built a small church and a shelter for travelers. The example of detachment and dedication to God shown by her uncle certainly influenced young Zita, shaping her character for a life of service and contemplation. At the age of 12, extreme poverty forced Zita to leave the comfort of her home in Montegrati. The decision was not easy for her parents, but the need to survive outweighed everything else. She was sent to the bustling city of Lucca to work as a domestic servant in the household of the Fatinelli family, wealthy and influential silk merchants who lived in an imposing residence near the Basilica of San Frediano. For such a young girl, raised in the quiet countryside, leaving her family to live in a large city, serving strangers in an environment of wealth and bustle, must have been a frightening and deeply painful experience. The longing for home, the fear of the unknown, and the harshness of the work could have hardened her heart. However, Zita accepted her new condition not with bitterness, sadness, or rebellion, but as the expressed will of God for her life. She understood, with a spiritual wisdom far beyond her tender age, that work, no matter how humble, tiring, and repetitive, was a concrete and daily way to serve Christ himself. Work is not a punishment, but an opportunity to love, she often thought, turning every action into a silent prayer. Life in the luxurious Fatinelli household, however, was far from easy for the little peasant girl. Zita was the youngest of the servants and initially suffered greatly at the hands of her older, more experienced co-workers. The other employees, perhaps envious of her evident purity or annoyed by her tireless diligence that exposed their own laziness, treated her with a mixture of contempt and cruelty. They openly mocked her piety, calling her a hypocrite and a saintly prude, and interpreted her silent submission and ready obedience as mere stupidity or weakness of character. They often gave her the heaviest, dirtiest, and most unpleasant tasks in the house, hoping to see her complain, cry, or fail in her duties. Even the employers themselves, at first influenced by the malicious gossip and intrigues of the other servants, often treated her with unjust severity and unfounded suspicion, demanding exhausting work from dawn till dusk, without any word of recognition or gratitude. Despite all the daily humiliations and constant injustice, Zita never lost her profound inner peace. She endured insults and mockery in absolute silence, never retaliating, murmuring, or complaining about her fate. Her response to cruelty and provocation was always meekness and immediate forgiveness. She saw in her masters, even when harsh, the authority delegated by God and served them with unwavering loyalty and sincere respect. The hand that sweeps the floor is the same that can touch heaven, she firmly believed, elevating the dignity of manual labor. To nurture this spiritual strength, Zita would wake hours before the rest of the household, often at dawn, to attend the morning Holy Mass at the nearby Basilica of San Frediano, ensuring that her devotion never interfered with her domestic duties. She performed each task, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant to human eyes, with perfection, zeal, and overflowing love, as if she were cleaning and tidying the very house of Jesus in Nazareth. Over the years, Zita's heroic patience, silent resilience, and extreme kindness began to radically transform the hostile environment around her. Gradually, the enmity and mockery of the other servants gave way to deep respect and sincere admiration. They finally realized that Zita's piety was not a sham or an attempt to please her masters, but the authentic expression of a heart genuinely turned toward God and full of charity for others. The masters, in turn, also opened their eyes and recognized the crystal clear honesty, tireless efficiency, and absolute loyalty of their servant. Lady Fatinelli, perceiving the true spiritual and human treasure she had in her home, began to trust Zita more and more, entrusting her with increasing responsibilities until she was placed in charge of all the household staff and the general administration of the house, becoming the trusted housekeeper of the family. Even with her new and elevated position of authority within the household, Zita did not change her humble and servile attitude in the slightest. She treated the other servants, many of whom had mistreated her in the past, with extreme kindness, understanding, and fairness, never using her newly acquired power to take revenge for offenses or humiliations suffered. On the contrary, she defended them before the masters when they made mistakes, took the blame for minor faults, and often helped them with their most difficult tasks. The trust that the Fatinelli family placed in her became total and unconditional. They allowed her to freely manage the family's alms and gave her the freedom to visit the poor, the imprisoned, and the sick in the city of Lucca. Zita transformed a small, isolated room in the house into a true refuge and makeshift hospital for those in need. At night, after finishing all her work, she would go out through the dark streets of Lucca, inviting poor, abandoned, and homeless women to dinner, often offering them her own bed to sleep in while she spent the night praying on the cold floor. Zita's charity was truly limitless and heroic. She divided her modest salary strictly into 3 parts. One part was sent to help her elderly parents in Monsagrati, a small portion was reserved for her own sparse basic needs, and the largest part was entirely dedicated to the poor and needy she encountered. Often she gave her own share of food to those who knocked at the door hungry, contenting herself only with the leftovers of the other servants, or simply fasting in silence. Her compassion for the suffering was so great, and her love so pure, that God began to manifest His power through her by means of extraordinary miracles and visible signs of His grace, events that quickly became beloved and revered legends among the people of Lucca. One of the most famous, beautiful, and frequently depicted miracles in art about the life of Saint Zita is the miracle of the flowers. During a time of great famine and scarcity that severely affected the city of Lucca, Zita was secretly carrying bread and other food from the abundant pantry of the Fatinelli family, carefully hidden in the folds of her apron, to distribute to the many poor and hungry who gathered daily at the doorstep seeking relief. Another servant, still driven by envy and malice, hastened to the master and formally accused her of stealing the family's food to give to the beggars. Mr. Fatinelli, furious at the supposed betrayal of his trusted housekeeper, intercepted Zita halfway, his face red with anger, and demanded to know what she was hiding so carefully in her apron. Caught by surprise but trusting entirely in divine providence and God's protection, Zita replied with simplicity and sweetness, "They are only flowers and roses, sir." When she opened her apron, to the absolute astonishment of her master and the terror of the accusing servant, the bread and food had miraculously transformed into a cascade of fresh, colorful, and intensely fragrant flowers, despite it being the middle of winter. Mr. Fatinelli, deeply moved by God's grace and recognizing the holiness of the woman living under his roof, asked Zita for forgiveness for his mistrust, and, from that memorable day forward, allowed her to use the household resources to help the poor without any restrictions or questions. Another deeply moving and widely celebrated miracle occurred on the icy Christmas Eve. The winter in Lucca was particularly harsh that year, with biting winds and snow, and Zita was preparing to attend the traditional midnight mass at the Basilica of San Frediano. Seeing her shiver from the cold in her thin, worn servant's clothes, Mr. Fatinelli, now much kinder, lent her a thick, lined, and very expensive woolen cloak, with the strict and explicit condition that she return it intact as soon as the mass was over. At the church door, amid the crowd arriving for the celebration, Zita encountered an elderly man, dressed only in tattered rags, shivering violently from the cold and nearly freezing. Moved by a deep and irresistible compassion, seeing in him the image of Christ himself suffering, she did not hesitate for a second to place her master's precious cloak over the frail shoulders of the poor man, kindly telling him to keep warm during the Mass and that she would retrieve it afterward. However, after the Mass, Zita lingered long in prayer before the nativity scene, and when she finally stepped out into the cold night, the old man and the precious cloak had completely vanished. Zita returned home facing the biting cold and with a heart heavy with worry, knowing she would face her master's just anger for the loss of such a valuable item. As expected, Mr. Fatinelli was furious over the loss of the costly cloak and severely reprimanded her for her recklessness and excessive trust in strangers. Zita endured the scolding in humble silence, without attempting to justify herself, trusting blindly that God would provide a solution. The next day, Christmas Day, while the Fatinelli family was gathered for the festive lunch, a stranger knocked at the mansion's door. It was the same elderly man from the night before, bringing back the woolen cloak perfectly folded and intact. He thanked Zita for the immense kindness that had kept him warm on the cold night, and as he turned away from the door, his face suddenly shone with a dazzling heavenly light, revealing to all present not as a common beggar, but as an angel of the Lord sent to test and reward the charity of the servant. The side door of the Basilica of San Frediano, where this miraculous encounter took place, is revered and known to this day as the Angel's Door, in memory of this extraordinary event. The daily life of Saint Zita was also marked by simple miracles that clearly demonstrated how God blessed and multiplied her daily work. It is told that on one particularly busy morning, Zita left the bread dough resting in the wooden trough to rush to the aid of a seriously ill neighbor who urgently needed help, or, according to other versions of the tradition, to immerse herself in a moment of ecstatic prayer in her small room. When she hurried back to the kitchen, fearing that the bread would not be ready in time for the important Fatinelli family meal, she found, to her great surprise, the breads perfectly kneaded, shaped with precision, and already baked in the oven, filling the entire house with a delicious and heavenly aroma. Since none of the other servants had touched the dough or approached the oven, everyone in the house reverently understood that angels had descended from heaven to do the humble servant's manual labor, while she attended to the things of God and neighbor. On another memorable occasion, during a terrible and prolonged drought that struck the region of Tuscany, Zita encountered an exhausted pilgrim, covered in dust and extremely thirsty, who begged her for a little water. As there was no clean and potable water available in the house at that moment of scarcity, she compassionately led him to the village's public well. She lowered a heavy copper jar into the nearly dry well, which contained only muddy, turbid, and brackish water, unfit for consumption. When offering the jar to the thirsty pilgrim, Zita, full of faith, made the sign of the cross over the dirty water, silently praying that God would purify it and quench the thirst of that poor man. When the pilgrim brought the jar to his lips and drank, the muddy water had miraculously transformed into a sweet, pure, and incredibly refreshing wine, immediately restoring his strength. Zita served the Fatinelli family with unwavering dedication for nearly 50 years of her life. She witnessed generations being born, growing up, and passing away in that very house, becoming over time not only a faithful servant or an efficient housekeeper, but a true spiritual mother and a pillar of wisdom for all the family members. Her entire life was a silent, constant, yet incredibly powerful testimony that true holiness does not require great heroic deeds in the eyes of the world, nor prominent positions in society, but rather a great and pure love placed in the small and repetitive actions of daily life. She taught through her daily example that the broom, the floor cloth, and the kitchen pots can be instruments of personal sanctification as effective and pleasing to God as the rosary, the hair shirt, or long hours of contemplation in monasteries, provided they are used with the pure intention to serve and please the Creator. On April 27, 1272, at the age of 60, after a lifetime of hard work and total dedication, Zita fell gravely ill. Feeling in her heart that her hour to meet the heavenly bridegroom had finally come, she asked for and received the last sacraments of the Church with great fervor and deep devotion. The entire Fatinelli family, who by this time openly venerated her as a living saint within their own home, gathered around her humble bed, weeping copiously over the imminent loss of their beloved servant, counselor, and friend. Zita died peacefully, without pain or agony, with a serene smile on her lips, surrendering her soul to God. The pious legend says that at the very moment of her death, a new and extraordinarily bright star appeared in the night sky, stopping exactly above the small attic where she slept, illuminating the city of Lucca with a gentle light and announcing to all the triumphant entrance of a great and humble soul into paradise. The news of Zita's death spread rapidly like wildfire throughout the city of Lucca and the neighboring villages. The people, who already knew intimately of her inexhaustible charity, her kindness, and the many miracles worked by her hands, flocked in large numbers to the Fatinelli household to pay their final and heartfelt respects to the one they called the Saint of Lucca. The mourning was widespread and profound, and the crowd, moved by spontaneous veneration, demanded that her body not be buried in a common cemetery, but rather laid to rest with honors in the Basilica of San Frediano, the very church she loved so dearly and faithfully, attended every dawn of her life. Zita's funeral was not a ceremony of sorrow, but a true spiritual triumph, with people from all social classes, nobles, merchants, peasants, and beggars, accompanying the coffin in procession and loudly proclaiming her undeniable holiness. Shortly after her death, popular devotion to Saint Zita grew in an extraordinary and uncontrollable manner. Countless miracles and graces received were quickly reported by those who sought her powerful intercession before God. Hopelessly ill patients were inexplicably healed, serious family problems were peacefully resolved, and, interestingly, many people began to invoke her successfully to find lost objects, especially keys, recalling that she, as the faithful and attentive housekeeper of the Fatinelli household, always carried a large bunch of keys fastened at her waist. The fame of her sanctity and miracles soon crossed the borders of Italy and spread rapidly throughout medieval Europe. In distant England, she became affectionately known as Saint Zita and grew immensely popular and venerated among housewives, domestic servants, and manual laborers, who saw in her a perfect model and a heavenly protector. In 1580, more than 300 years after her death, the tomb of Saint Zita was solemnly opened by ecclesiastical authorities for the official recognition of her relics. To the marvelous astonishment of all present, including doctors and clergy, her body was found perfectly incorrupt, miraculously preserved from the natural decay that affects human flesh. This extraordinary and inexplicable fact only further intensified the fervent popular devotion that had existed for centuries. The sacred body was then carefully placed in a beautiful glass urn and displayed for the continuous veneration of the faithful in the Basilica of San Frediano, where it remains intact to this day, attracting thousands of pilgrims every year. Modern paleopathological studies, conducted at the end of the 20th century, scientifically confirmed that the body is a natural mummy, preserved without the use of any chemicals or embalming techniques, and revealed touching details of her difficult and sacrificial life, such as clear signs of severe malnutrition suffered in childhood and chronic lung problems caused by the constant inhalation of smoke from the fireplaces and wood stoves in the kitchen where she worked her entire life. Despite the intense, uninterrupted, and fervent popular devotion that had existed since the day of her death in the 13th century, the official canonization of Saint Zita through the formal procedures of the Church took several centuries to occur. It was only on September 5, 1696, that Pope Innocent XII, recognizing the unquestionable validity of her ancient cult and the truth of her many miracles, solemnly ratified and confirmed her sanctity, definitively inscribing her name in the Roman martyrology. However, the overwhelming power of her holiness had long been widely acknowledged by local authorities, the Church, and Italian culture itself. The great and celebrated Italian poet Dante Alighieri, when writing his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, in the early 14th century, referred to an important magistrate of the city of Lucca simply as the Elder of Saint Zita, clearly and poetically demonstrating that, for the people of that time, The identity of the city of Lucca and the luminous figure of its patron saint were already absolutely inseparable realities. Centuries later, in 1955, recognizing the relevance and importance of her message for the modern world, Pope Pius XII officially proclaimed Saint Zita as the universal patroness of domestic workers, housekeepers, and all those who labor in the home, thereby elevating the dignity of these often undervalued professions. She is also affectionately venerated as the patroness of bakers due to the beautiful miracle of the bread baked by angels and as a zealous protector of homemakers. Every year, on April 27th, the day of her passing into heaven, the city of Lucca joyfully celebrates the liturgical feast of their most beloved saint with great devotion and public festivities. The historic streets surrounding the Basilica of San Frediano and the ancient Roman amphitheater are richly adorned with thousands of colorful flowers, vividly recalling the miracle of the apron, and small blessed loaves of bread are distributed to the faithful and pilgrims as a symbol of sharing and charity. The extraordinary life of Saint Zita of Lucca remains a shining beacon of hope and an inexhaustible source of inspiration for all of us, especially in today's busy and materialistic world. In a contemporary society that often and mistakenly measures a person's intrinsic worth by visible professional success, the size of their bank account, the accumulation of material possessions, or their fleeting influence on social media, humble Zita reminds us powerfully and clearly that true and lasting greatness lies solely in sincere humility and selfless service to others. She teaches us, through the eloquence of her quiet life, that no task is insignificant, lesser, or unworthy when performed with genuine love and pure intention. Washing dirty dishes, cooking a simple meal for the family, patiently caring for children, sweeping a dusty floor, or tidying the house can become acts of profound and sublime worship of God, true domestic liturgies, if our hearts are constantly turned toward Him and the good of our brothers and sisters. Saint Zita gently yet persistently invites us to discover the holiness hidden within the ordinary and routine fabric of our lives. She challenges us to change our perspective and to see the people around us, especially those who serve us daily or hold positions considered subordinate by society, with the utmost respect, gratitude, and dignity, recognizing in every weary face the very image of the suffering Christ. Through her trials, she teaches us to respond to injustice and aggression with the disarming strength of meekness, to transform the poison of envy with the antidote of active kindness, and to make our daily work, no matter how exhausting, a continual and pleasing offering to God. May the luminous and enduring example of this humble Tuscan servant deeply inspire us to live our days with more authentic love, unwavering patience, and generous dedication, turning the small, repetitive, and seemingly insignificant tasks of our everyday life into great and sure steps that will lead us to the glory of heaven. The story you have just heard unmistakably shows us that holiness is not an unattainable privilege reserved for a small group of chosen ones, monks or martyrs, but rather a universal and urgent call for all of us, regardless of our profession, level of education, or social status. If you know someone in your family, community, or workplace who lives this silent holiness day by day, serving others with tireless love, patience, and profound humility, just as Saint Zita of Lucca did, please share your testimony in the comments below to edify our community. Share this video with your friends and family so that many more people may be touched and inspired by this beautiful and transformative example of Christian life. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to continue learning about and marveling at the stories of other great heroes of the faith who changed the world with their love. Prayer to Saint Zita. O glorious and humble Saint Zita, who in the simplicity and hardship of daily domestic work found the sure path to the highest spiritual perfection, teach us to love and value our daily tasks, no matter how monotonous they may seem. You who endured humiliations, injustices, and mockeries with heroic and unwavering patience, and who transformed your exhausting service into a continual and fervent prayer of praise. Help us to have your eyes to see the loving face of Christ in all those we serve and meet along our way. Powerfully intercede for us before God, that we may fulfill our duties with true joy, honesty, and overflowing love, transforming the small and routine things of everyday life into firm steps that lead us to heaven. Protect under your mantle all domestic workers, devoted homemakers, and all manual laborers throughout the world, so that they may always find dignity, respect, just reward, and deep peace in their noble occupations. Through Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns forever. Amen.